Well, at this time, I think if, unless you guys want to have anything else you want to say at this point, we'll take questions from the floor. And what I'll try to do is try to limit y'all's responses to like 2 minutes so we can get to more questions from the floor. And I will ask that when you ask your question, have a question, not a presentation, and we'll get you some answers. So, yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Do you have any process for taking old laws off the book? Like you have this huge process for passing more and more and more and more and more and more laws. And just a second quick question, on the average, how many laws get passed in a session?
Joe, go ahead.
Yes, ma'am. There's actually a bill we do at the end of the session each year that updates outdated laws. And secondly, there's numerous bills during the session that will amend, take an antiquated law, update it, or eliminate old statute. And that happens every year, so it's not always increasing, it's sometimes amending or updating existing statute. And I think last year we had about 620 bills. Those that became law, I think were about, and Shawn can correct me, about 182. One other interesting statistic, of the 600 bills that we worked on, about 400 were bipartisan. And there's going to be some bills that the Democrats and Republicans are going to go head-to-head on, but there's a lot more bipartisanship that you'll see behind the scenes. And I'll mention some examples in a minute, but I just wanted to mention that statistic.
And how many laws on the average would you take off the books every year then?
That's a good question. I don't know, but I don't know.
I got an idea. How about for every bill y'all introduce, you have to repeal one?
I don't know the answer to your question.
I'm sorry.
How many get repealed? I do know that the annual bill to repeal obsolete laws isn't very comforting to small government conservative people.
We're down to one mic.
It isn't much help because it really does repeal obsolete laws, you know, not allowing your horse to urinate on the sidewalk or something like that. I mean, there are bills that have lost all relevance to what happens on the street, and they found their way into this annual cleanup bill. The challenge with saying, I'm going to say one thing that sort of disagrees with you, but then I'm going to agree with you a whole heck of a lot. The challenge to saying for every bill we add, every law we add, we have to take one off, is that everyone will have different ideas about which one we should take off. So you're going to hold good policy hostage to everyone agreeing that this is the law we're going to repeal. Although I love the idea. Here's why that whole discussion is just a little bit misleading. If I wanted to repeal a law, I mean a good step for freedom, it would still take a bill to do it. And someone watching the process would say, look, they passed a bill. What did they take off the books? Well, every bill you pass, every law you repeal takes passing a bill or a law to make that happen. So not all of the laws that get adopted in a session are net increases to the amount of law on the books. But most are, and we already have, like, you know how many volumes of the CRS there are?
Enough to cover up a bookshelf.
A whole library shelf full, thanks Dave, of laws on the books already. If the Colorado Legislature got nuked tomorrow and were out of commission for several years, except for some measure to pass an annual budget, nobody would notice, nobody would care. We have enough laws on the books already, and the important services that government administers come out of the executive branch, not the legislative branch. And for my money, we should limit further, like maybe to 2 or 3 proposals a year instead of the 5 plus extras, and shorten the legislative session from 120 days to maybe 90 days or 60 days.
I'm not sure I agree with on the last point on reducing the session, because 4 months to me seems about the right time to actually have a discussion and a debate. In terms of the actual number of bills, I'd be comfortable with 3 or 4. But again, I also remind my colleague that some of those good bills that constituents brought to me that actually impacted their lives came later in the cycle, when I had already introduced my first 3 bills, and I'm glad I had those extra 2 to try to help out my constituents.
Yes, sir. We'll get to you.
What is the name of the staff of lawyers that writes these bills? How are they paid? Where are their offices? And are they full-time year-round? With these number of bills that you guys are talking about, that's a lot of stuff. And if they go past you on a conveyor, it seems to me that they should start the process a lot earlier than it seems appropriate for elections to take place.
Go ahead, John.
There are two, is this on? Yeah, now it is. There are two service agencies for the legislature. One is called Legislative Council, that they staff the committees and they do general policy research for us. The other agency is called Legislative Legal Services. They are the lawyer for the legislature and the drafting office for the legislature. They are full-time employees of the legislative branch. Their busy season is the couple of months leading up to and during the 4 months of the legislative session. They have a slower cycle the rest of the 6 months of the year, but they do a lot of other legal research and preparation and staffing other committees and doing other things. But it's certainly busier in the run-up to and the operation of the legislature. They're nonpartisan, full-time employees of the legislative branch. There's one other thing I was going to say, but paid by state tax dollars. And they don't work for one party or the other. They get assigned bill requests based on their area of expertise. Oh, your point about they should start earlier. The Constitution says when our session can run. It starts.
No, I meant they're writing of the bills. If they're year round, they're before and after the session.
Yes, but there would be no schedule that would require legislators to receive them and review them. Conscientious ones would, but a lot wouldn't. A lot of legislators, we need to make our living, in theory, during the other 8 months of the year, and the time that we have to be able to be lawmakers is during the 4 months of the session, and it wouldn't necessarily improve things to have drafted bills sitting out there floating around waiting for lawmakers to come play lawmaker out of season.
Joe, any more on that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Shawn said. The only thing I would add is that some legislators do go during the summer and fall with a bill idea and sit down with a bill drafter, someone from legislative legal services, and say, hey, I've got this idea, can you help me start to draft it or research it through legislative council? And I can't tell you what yeoman's work they do. I mean, they're professional to a fault. They're extremely hardworking. I mean, sometimes we'll be at a committee hearing till midnight and they're there. I mean, I just really respect them.
And
How many are there?
About 50.
And that reminded me, we'll get you.
No,
There's 50 total.
About 50 total.
Okay.
Right. And as far as you guys working till midnight sometimes, on that website, there's audio of everything and video of a lot of stuff. So if you're at home and you're interested in something, you don't have to go down to the Capitol. You can watch it on your computer. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you guys to describe the nuances of the leadership selection that happens on both sides of the aisle. I guess the first part of the question is, how do you prevent, on the Republican side, Douglas County, for an example, where they have such a high penetration rate of Republican legislatures, and on the Democrat side, Denver, for example, of Democrats, from ruling the way that this leadership selection uses. And I would like to get some feedback on this specific leadership that was just chosen right now. Last year in the House, David Ballmer was the #2 guy after Mike May. Well, they take the majority, and not only is he not in leadership, he doesn't even have a committee appointment. And it seems like to me that's an example that Douglas County guys kind of took over and rushed the show, and I think some of that's happened with Terrence Carroll and people on the Democrat side as well. Can you guys talk about a little bit of how that happens and what's going on behind the scenes?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Joe.
It's truly personality and leadership driven. I'll give you an example. Sal Pace is the new minority leader in the Colorado State House of Representatives. Right now there's 33 Republicans and 32 Democrats. Sal's from Pueblo. The other gentleman that was challenging him was Andy Kerr, a Democrat from Lakewood. So, I mean, traditionally there's been some Denver leaders on the Democratic side, but you've also had a pretty consistent pattern of some of the rural communities or the burbs being represented. On the Republican side, you know, Frank McNulty was viewed as the leader over the past year in terms of his ability to fundraise. I know that's sometimes controversial to talk about. Both sides do it. Well, I mean, he put a lot of time in all summer and fall raising money for his colleagues, and he did a good job. And
he raised less money than Ballmer did. When Ballmer had that same role prior year.
Yeah, I don't want to get involved in all those politics.
I think it goes back to personalities, as Joe said. It's like high school.
Yeah.
Well, I just don't understand, because I've heard that same argument about money, but it's like, it doesn't add up. Something's going on down there that doesn't add up.
Okay, here's what I will say. This is really politically dicey, but I'm trying to be upfront about this. I mean, it is a tough question. But I want to be honest. From what I've heard, I'm going to use this, I'm going to follow up on your example. There have been some members who were concerned about some of the past of Representative Ballmer when he was a representative in North Carolina, and they feared if he was their leader, as a Speaker of the House, that my party would use it against them and always bring up some of the dirt, and they would never be able to advance their agenda. Now, whether that's fair or not, that's some of
I
the...
appreciate the real answer, thank you.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Joe. All right, make a note, we got a real answer. Shawn, go
I'm
ahead.
just going to throw a couple more things about leadership races, and that's not the whole of the answer, because there was also some resistance to Representative Ballmer because he was a very effective fundraiser, but also a slightly aggressive, more than slightly aggressive, abrasive one. And he made more enemies than friends, piling up the dollars that he did, and that ruffled some feathers both in and out of the legislature, and even in his own party that was the beneficiary of the fundraising. There is no magic formula. It's a secret ballot by each caucus that elects its leadership. And the factors that Joe mentioned, personality, fundraising ability, individual relationships with all the legislators, geography. Often, outstate legislators don't like most leadership coming from Metro Denver, at least in the Republican Party, so they would rather go outstate a little bit. You have an advantage coming from the Western Slope. Or, by the way, you mentioned Douglas County. El Paso County is an even bigger stronghold of united voting strength. All these factors come into play, and there's no way to rule it or regulate it because the respective parties' caucuses make their own rules for how they elect leadership. So there's not going to be any kind of clean government reform of the caucus vote on how to elect. And it is sort of like a school popularity contest. And sometimes it elevates merit, sometimes it elevates cronyism, sometimes it elevates fundraising prowess, sometimes lightning strikes and no one can figure out what the heck happened in that vote. Mary Dobman, does that describe about the way it was when you served in the legislature also?
Yes, because we had challenges frequently. Most of it was worked out. But I remember some serious challenges for majority leader. Plus, I'd like to point out that David Ballmer does have an assignment. I looked at the list, and David has a committee assignment.
Oh, okay. Good.
Any questions from over here? Yes, sir, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the point's already been made that there's a whole lot of laws. If an individual, a citizen, has a problem that's happened and appears to be the fault of the government, how does he know where to begin? You know, the idea of a bill. Maybe it's rulemaking, maybe it's constitutional, maybe it's statutory. Is there someone at the staff of 50 lawyers help someone figure out? Can a citizen go and say, hey, this happened, what do we do about it?
Go ahead, Shawn.
The short answer is yes. There is not enough of that kind of resource, but both the governor's office has the governor's ombudsman or citizen advocate or something like that, and the legislature has a constituent service function where if you call your representative or senator and it's something that's beyond the scope of their, we get one part-time aide for each of us during the session. That is our staff. We get a couple of college interns and a part-time aide. And if it's beyond that level of resource, there is a function down in, I mentioned two services. One is legislative legal services, the other one is legislative counsel. There is a constituent service arm in legislative counsel where there are 2 or 3 people whose job it is to respond to these kinds of inquiries, tell people what government agency they may or may not be able to petition. If it turns out that it's because the law is X or because a regulator did Y, they may be able to identify the issue and put it in front of the city. They don't become their private lawyer. Just the resources aren't there to do that, but they might give them the information about where to begin unraveling the stream.
I'll just add to that, use me and use us. Many times we'll get an email to all 100 legislators, and I'm proud to say that the person says you're only one of like 3 legislators that responded, even though they weren't my district, because they may have a legitimate issue. I mean, to me, constituent service is the most important part of this job. And I want to use my title, the power that I do have for the people, to navigate through the bureaucracy to help that constituent. It's one of the most satisfying things I do. I'll be a dog on a bone if I think a constituent needs some help.
Yeah, so I think if you don't know where to start, call your representative or senator, and hopefully he'll point you in the right direction if he can't help you directly, or she, obviously.